Some of you may know me as Zombieapple, others may know me as Sauce Boss, depends on where you follow me. Um, I wanted to try a little tutorial today, a three-part tutorial. I noticed a couple of people had been asking me questions about how I do the shading, and, I suppose it's not too many people who asked me about it, but I figured, what the heck. I thought I'd give people a little idea. So, first part, we're going to start off with this sphere here, and I'm going to show you like the basics of what I do to shade. Then the next part is going to be a character. This is Katie Cat. We're going to be applying what I teach you in the first one to that, and in the third one I'm going to show you how to do compositing, and that's sort of Who Framed Roger Rabbit type deal, and we're going to see if we can't put a character in this chair. Okay, so let's get started with the first one. What I always do is I like to select the area that I'm actually working on, the specific color, the specific shape. It really helps because at that, when you do that, you can go across it with a pen and not worry about going outside the lines. I'm going to fix the opacity on that. So you can go clear across the edges of the sphere, and that's really going to help us. So, usually what people like to do when they're going to shade something, first off, let's get a color. Probably going to get like a light orange like that. That sounds nice. Yep. And on a separate layer, so for those of you who might be like new to Photoshop or a painting program, I like to work with layers a lot. I like to make sure almost everything is on a separate layer so I can adjust it later when I need to. And I'm going to set this new layer to overlay, or actually, you know what, soft light. I've been finding soft light works a lot better, because what will happen is if you have a multicolored picture, like a character, is that it's better to use like overlay or soft light, because it'll still kind of have a hint of that color through. It won't just be solid blue or whatever the shading color you have is. So a lot of the time when people like to shade, they like to use something like black, and they'll go around the edge like that. If you're going to do a sphere, and then do the highlights up here. I used to do that, and that seems, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult because you get some uneven parts right here, and you really have to kind of work with it. But there's a much easier way of doing this, so that it's a little more clean, it's not inconsistent, it's not so sketchy. I don't usually use black, actually. You can. Again, this isn't, what you have to do in general. This is just based on what I do. I will either use a very dark blue, like something like this, or a dark purple. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe that will catch on the capture. I'll check it when I edit it. So let's just stick with this dark blue here, because with black you usually get a well, I guess it's not very different from this, but usually with colors, you might see it in the next video, you can tell that it has a more colorful shading to it. Like if we were just put normal, we come over here and we bring the layer opacity down, if you actually go into photographs and things like that, you can see that even in real life, shadows appear to be blue and not actually black. So, enough messing around with that. I'm going to show you what I do is, instead of coloring in where the shadows are, I fill the entire object. But not just that, it's usually a good idea to pick a color that is going to show up the absolute darkest that you want it to look. So the absolute darkest shadow, it needs to be the same color as the darkest shadow on the entire object, whether it's a character, whether it's just this sphere. It needs to be the absolute darkest. So now it's as if the whole sphere is completely shaded. So what we're going to do is, instead of adding shadows to something that's already lit, we're going to add light to something that's already shaded, because the brushes in this are typically very circular. And when you have something like on a character, or in this case a sphere, it works for characters too, and other objects, when you erase it, you're getting a very curved brush, and so it doesn't look so uneven on the shadows. So instead of adding shading to an already lit object, we're going to put our shadow and apply it to everything, and then just erase where the light is. Now I just did that with 100% opacity on this eraser, but what I like to do, especially for more complex things, is bring it down to about 25%. Now it's not taking everything off, but it's taking some of it off, and we're just going to do this multiple times. The first time I'm going to do everything except where I want the shadow to be its absolute darkest, like we talked about just a few seconds ago. And then I'm going to go over it again, but this time I'm not going to go as far as I did before. And some of it is keeping track of how far you went, and some of it is really just how it looks. And see, now I'm just focusing on this top spot. And so you get a nicer gradient. I suppose you could use the gradient tool, but this gives you more control if it's not just a simple circle. Again, you'll probably see what I'm talking about when we do a character, but this is just the basic principles of what I'm doing. And then, if we take off this layer in the sphere, and we see just what I applied, bring that back to normal, you can see that even in like black and white, or in this case blue and white, that it still has that form. And another thing I used to do is take the line art of a character and simply just do it in black and white, all the shading, and then apply the colors later. And you can do it that way too. Maybe if we want to do overlay, it's a little more emphasized. That's what I found, is that overlay is a little more saturated. It leaves the colors a little more saturated and contrasted, where soft light blend is it's a little bit easier. But for this, we're going to do overlay since it shows up a little bit better. Okay, and then on top of that, I'm going to again make a new layer. And this one, you don't need to make it, well, let's make it another soft light layer. And we're going to go over here, and we're going to pick white. I could pick yellow, but I think just for now I'm going to use white. Again, this is another thing, is always find ways in which you can replace something that's just black or white or gray with like an actual color. If it's black, replace it with a very dark blue or a dark purple. If it's white, replace it with, instead use yellow or a very, very light color, or like pink or something. And it's a good way of making sure that your works stay very colorful and very vibrant while still being able to apply shadows and highlights. Speaking of highlights, that's what we're going to do now, is again, because this brush has a circular shape, it splays out over the shape a lot nicer. You don't have to worry about keeping the form of the thing you're working on. So this one we're not going to be erasing. This one we're actually using the brush on top of the layer that we had shaded. So if we just kind of do the reverse, or kind of like continue on with what we were doing with the shadings, we take the area that is most lit and we kind of give that a highlight. That doesn't look the best. I am still figuring out how to use this. tablet brush. Well, you get the idea. Um, just the same area that I'm covering, only a much nicer gradient. We could probably actually just, you don't have to do this. I'm gonna guess that you're probably more prepared than I am and can have a very gradual change between this to this, but I'm just gonna erase this to show you what I mean, how it's supposed to look. See, that's a much nicer transition. Okay. Now, this looks pretty good, but if you want to go even further and add a little bit more detail, you can come in here. You want to, like, I guess not make more detail, but rather you want to stylize it a bit more. One thing I like to do is I take the underside of objects like this, hold on, and give it another highlight just around the edge, so it's as if the light from the surface is reflecting. And you can use this same method if you have like a light, like if the idea in your picture is you have a light source from off screen, perhaps you have like a blue that's coming from the other side, you can just go around the edge with a very bright color and kind of create this illusion. You're getting a softer light from another direction. So that adds a little bit more to it. You know, that adds a little bit more to the form. It shows it being a little bit more reflective. If we want, we can even get a bigger brush. I don't always do this. This actually just kind of popped in my head, and we can kind of go around here. And it kind of adds like a softness around that area, so it seems like it's spreading a little bit further than where we were just touching. And yeah, that kind of really helps with the form. So one last thing with the spheres, you can do this with any color. As you can see, it doesn't really require that you get an orange in order to shade it, or like a darker orange to shade it, or a lighter, like a yellow, to highlight it. You can use whites and blues, or whites and purples. And, you know, basically, the thing to take from this tutorial is don't try to add shading to something that's already lit. It can be much easier if you fill it with the darkest color first and then add lighting later, because it's a lot easier to do this and fill in a circular motion than it is trying to get along the edges like that. So one last thing is just for this sphere to give you like more ideas, because later we're going to be going into shading a character that's supposed to look like they're in the real world, so you've got to get some concepts of how shading works. Highlights, hopefully you already know some of this, but if you don't, highlights are the area where light is hitting an object. Shadows are obviously the part where the light is not getting there as much, and there's usually a graduation, a sort of gradation between the two. And this lighting we did under here is sort of like an underlighting or a bottom lighting, because even flat surfaces like a table that aren't very reflective will reflect some light, and you will get some of that. And that's going to come in handy with making this picture look very realistic, is keeping track of this kind of lighting and this kind of lighting, and making sure you're matching, you know, the kind of lighting in your scene accurately, and knowing how, you know, how gradually should it be, how dark should the shadow be, you know, should there be an underlighting here, and how intense should it be. And underneath here we're gonna get like another dark blue again, and I'm just gonna show you a little bit about doing this shading down here, like the shadow from the ball. I'm gonna give you a little more on how this should be done. So if we zoom in here a little bit more, we know that the ball is making contact here. So that is the spot that is probably going to be the absolute darkest. because it's not very likely that light from our light source coming through here is going to reach this area very easily. So that's going to be the darkest part where it's making contact. Spots where there's like a very tight crevice like that are the parts that are going to be the darkest, and the spots that are more out in the open like this are going to be the lightest. So we're going to do that thing again where we're erasing some of it away, but remember some things. Like, for example, even though this is the darkest spot, it's probably going to be darker right around here where it's just under the ball than it is out here where it's not under the ball anymore. So we go over one time, and let's go right up to the spot where it's going to be the darkest. And this time we're going to go over once more, but we're going to stop short at that spot where we think, it's right under the ball. And we're going to leave this side alone because that's still completely under the ball. And then maybe just for good measure right here so it looks like it's kind of fading away. Just do it over a couple times. And then when we deselect it, that's a pretty nice looking shadow. So again, this isn't, official of what you should do. This is just my methods of what I do. So that's it for this video, and in the second one we'll go into working on applying what we learned there onto a character. Okay.